Misinformation has gone from being a niche topic in communication studies to a widely seen phenomenon that occurs every day in our mainstream media, as the prevalence and effectiveness of misinformation has become normal. Through this video, you'll learn how the media effect of framing is used within the context of misinformation, as well as how these effects impact the spread of misinformation and perpetuate disinformation. First, let's start with a discussion of framing before we link it to the topic of misinformation specifically. Framing refers to the process by which a communication source, such as a news organization, defines and constructs a political issue or public controversy. Think about the way a story is presented and how that impacts your perception of it. An analogy that comes to mind when I think about this is a gift that you're going to give to someone. Like, let's say you're giving someone a present. How you actually present the gift is going to change the recipient's receiving of it, despite the actual gift itself being constant, being the same. Presenting something in a beautiful gift bag with pristine wrapping paper, and a beautiful card versus something that's hastily thrown together with duct tape is going to be a much different experience despite the actual contents inside being the same. Text and the story behind how you then receive or give that gift essentially is the frame. How something is presented, in other words, impacts your experience of it. So let's look at a more tangible example. These two jars of frozen yogurt seen in this picture, each of them contain the exact same ingredients. The container on the left is presented as containing 20% fat, while the container on the right is presented or framed as being 80% fat-free. Now, again, both of these are the exact same containers of yogurt, but which one feels like the healthier choice? Probably most of us would say the container on the right, despite, again, both of them being exactly the same containers of yogurt, just framed differently. This is essentially the effect of framing. In academic circles, frames are generally divided into two approaches, one being issue emphasis framing and the other being generic framing. Generic framing encompasses thematic and episodic frames, which differ in their scope, their breadth, and their depth of orienting the audience to the story, with thematic frame focusing on the bigger picture, community, like the larger societal impact, and episodic frames focusing on a specific episode or like instance of that happening. In issue emphasis framing, on the other hand, emphasis is placed on certain aspects of the story in order to create meaning and indicate significance to the audience. I kind of like to think of this as like the parts being greater than the sum of the whole, and then in generic framing, it's like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Now, let's talk a little bit about how misinformation fits into this picture. Misinformation can be defined as any information that turns out to be false, which seems like quite a simple definition for such a complex and loaded topic. Now, misinformation has become much more widespread in the past 2 decades, largely due to the amount of exposure to information that individuals have, as well as the virality of false beliefs. However, research into misinformation that's transmitted has found that there isn't one specific culprit that has caused it to become so prevalent, and that it's connected to a myriad of different social, psychological, and cognitive mechanisms that operate in much the same way as when we're presented with truthful information. For one, repeated exposure to a false claim makes people more susceptible to believing it to be true. Because of peripheral cues that are used in information processing, we're more likely to accept a piece of data as factual the more we see it, which can be seen in information that is both true and information that is untrue. People also tend to look for information that confirms their worldview and the beliefs that they already hold, and having a lack of critical thinking ability or literacy can also make one more susceptible to believing misinformation, especially if information is being delivered from what that person deems a trustworthy or authoritative source. They're more likely to then believe it. Also, it's important to discuss the role of emotion when examining misinformation. Emotional appeals are generally more salient than appeals that are based on other things like logic or reasoning, empirical evidence, etc. Emotional appeals are also more likely to be processed peripherally according to the elaboration likelihood model, which doesn't have as high a level of involvement of critical evaluation or information as central processing does. Effects lead to political rumors, fake news, and disinformation to dominate our information highways, as misinformation spreads much faster and with more fervor than facts do. Now, to examine how framing affects the spread of misinformation. Once one has been exposed to misinformation, it's difficult to then alter those beliefs, even when you're presented with factual counter evidence that proves that misinformation to be false. This is known as the continued influence effect, which dominates how factual information is not always cognitively linked to the misinformation, which is also more easily accessed. Thus, attempts at correcting misinformation through thematic framing will likely fall on deaf ears, as these types of frames are more likely to be centrally processed and use more logic-based appeals than the emotional appeals that emphasis frames offer. Let's look at a few examples of how framing is used to spread as well as to target misinformation. So first, looking at this example from Florida Surgeon General Joseph Ladapo, who wrote a letter to the head of the FDA and CDC saying that the COVID-19 vaccines were dangerous because of a 4,400% increase, so quite a lot, of individuals reporting adverse effects to the vaccine adverse event reporting system in the state of Florida. You can see in this news piece from the Florida Department of Health how the issue is being framed thematically, or at least they're trying to, despite this actually being an episodic example of data that has been misconstrued and misconflated, as these incidents in this reporting system are entirely based on self-report. They include reports of all vaccinations, not just COVID-19 specific ones, and aren't even necessarily labeled. And they also don't prove any type of connection between a vaccine that someone's received and some other kind of symptomatology, since none of it requires any burden of proof. Again, it's entirely based on self-report. However, this is framed here in this USA Today piece using an episodic frame that focuses on the person who's actually receiving the misinformation, that attempts to fix the conditions that the falsehood could cause through what's known as pre-bunking. So the title of this piece acts as a warning to the reader that what they're about to encounter is misinformation, which doing this kind of pre-bunking has been shown to have mitigating effects. Another example can be seen in this news story of Disney employees protesting being forced to return to their corporate office 4 days a week. The title falsely claims that the employees are not wanting to work at all and are protesting their actual employment, when the employees actually very much want to maintain their employment at Disney, but are merely advocating for the ability to continue to work from home instead of going into the office. There is an attempt to frame this around the larger thematic frames of labor and the economy and the labor shortage and people not wanting to work has been going on for the past couple of years. While this is actually not related to any of that, it's related to specific working conditions and working from home versus working from the office, and is really a lot more of a structural labor issue than something that's related to work ethic or some type of broader economic message. Now, in our last example, this is going to be a little bit trickier. I want to take a look at the recent Norfolk Southern train derailment that happened in East Palestine, Ohio. This is a little bit dicier, as I said, because the National Transportation Safety Board has ruled that the levels of dangerous carcinogens in the air and water are well below harmful levels to life. Citizens who live in the local community have reported experiencing negative health consequences, and there's been a mass casualty of local wildlife in the area. What is the actual misinformation here? Both of these stories use emotional appeals, as the head of the NTSB cites the vital statistics and assures their commitment to justice and accountability. But on the other hand, the emphasis framing of the direct experience and inconsistencies in anecdotal evidence in the second piece are meant to create anger and confusion in the reader that plants those seeds of doubt. So what can be done? I want to close by sharing the ACLR framework, which has been created in order to address and to help mitigate the effects of misinformation. So basically, this model uses a lot of different elements of critical thinking and media literacy and critical analysis in order to empower one to be able to look at a piece of information and understand and unpack its factual accuracy. It's not one particular skill or like one particular attribute. It's a multitude of things, as you can see from this graphic, and really it's about giving people the tools so that they, when they're faced with any kind of a story, a fact, a piece of information, some kind of claim, they can themselves understand how to actually assess that piece of information and to empower them to take an active role in that process versus just passively taking in information and just assuming credibility or assuming reliability. I think there's a lot more even that could be said. It was hard to even kind of limit it to this, but framing is really something that's exploited around misinformation or to perpetuate misinformation quite a lot. But the positive side of that coin is that it's also something that can be used to help mitigate the negative and harmful effects of misinformation. So thank you so much for watching.